of Solitude is pretty good, if you like that sort of thing. That sort of thing being critical darling indie games about mental health, which, now that I think about it, is that's what most critical darling indie games are about, is about mental health. I think it's in their contract. And it's not hard to see why. I mean, most creative people are pretty much miserable all of the time, often with good reason. But on that note, critical darling indie games about mental health is the sort of thing that I do tend to have a fondness for. Many of them do speak to me on personal levels, but I tend to be a bit more critical of them than many because I have played a lot of them, and these days they really need to stand out. I spoke about this somewhat, about indie platform games, in particular about mental health, when I talked about Gris, a game that came out last year, I think, if I think about it, I think it was last year. And I've got similar issues with this, where it's not a bad game, not at all. It's charmingly presented, it hits on some important topics of discussion, but it doesn't do much to stand out. It does feel like yet another one on the pile, which doesn't make it bad. It's very serviceable, but it's not a game that's stuck with me. It's not a game that I'm really going to remember too long from now. This isn't going to make my roundups when I think about games that came out this year. It's fine. It's nicely presented, it's got a very nice visual style. I'll talk about that first and foremost. I really like its use of colour to inform the tone of each section of the game. You get these moments of respite that are really brightly coloured, with beautiful music. The soundtrack is incredible when music is used. And they're juxtaposed against these really dark, muted levels, these chapters, these sections, where there's a lot of grey, a lot of black, but it's used in a way that really sets the scene, and can be quite evocative on a visual level. But the thing that really stands out with the art direction is the design of the monsters. There are various creatures that show up to impede the progress of the player character Kay, or simply act as storyline points. And I simply love their design. They're all portrayed in these shades of grey and black, very much like the somber areas of the game, often with these red eyes that contrast everything. And they look incredible. There's a big mutant chameleon, a gorgon-like sea creature, and Kay herself, as you can see, shares monstrous traits with the more antagonistic elements of the game. She's covered in this thick black fur with the red eyes, leaving these little footprints behind, which is an effect I really like until I pay too much attention to them and notice when the footprints don't line up with the actual footsteps. But when I don't notice that, it's a really nice effect. The audio-visual presentation is by far Sea of Solitude's strongest feature. The gameplay itself is fine. It's a bit more of a mixed bag. For the most part, it's wandering around a drenched world, engaging in fairly simple, straightforward puzzle platforming. And even to call it that would be to overstate exactly how it's implemented, because it's all incredibly rudimentary. You do some jumping, you collect a few things here and there, you play keep away with monsters now and then. There are sections that I hesitate to call stealth, because again, it's so straightforward. It's more like simply running around enemies, trying not to let them hit you. You just saw a section where you have to avoid a big monster fish by timing where the monster is against where you are, and jumping into the water and swimming to the next bit of land before the monster fish grabs you and eats you. That turns up fairly regularly throughout the game, and again, it's as simple as it looks in the footage. There's nothing really of depth to the gameplay. Generally, it doesn't have to be. A game doesn't have to be innovative or super complex, but it should at least be excellent in whatever it does, if it's not going to be particularly inventive. And Sea of Solitude is not excellent in this regard. The controls are the controls are fine. It's more how Kay, the character, moves. She's a little bit wobbly, a little bit uneasy sometimes. I've had moments where I've climbed up onto a ledge, tried to readjust, but she overshot with just the slightest nudge of the control stick. It's one of those games where precision of movement was not a priority in development, and Even though the platforming really is not complicated at all, it can nonetheless be a bit annoying when there are moments where there are lethal drops and you try and adjust a little bit, but, you know, she falls off the ledge because you weren't expecting her to move so abruptly and so unsubtly with regards to your movements. Speaking of unsubtle, I did mention that this game is... well, it doesn't exactly play things close to its chest. What monsters represent and what the themes are delivered incredibly upfront to the player. There's not much room for... Even though everything visually is metaphorical, it's so straightforward and blatant in what the representations are that, again, very much like with every single gameplay element, I hesitate to call it what I should be calling it, which is metaphorical. In fact, despite the fact that all the monsters represent certain people and feelings and whatnot, it's very possible the game is being literal with it as well, that the monsters don't just represent people and places and feelings, they literally are those places, people and feelings, which is actually fairly interesting because so many video games of this type do focus on the purely metaphorical. This monster represents a thing, it's not really the thing, this all takes place inside someone's head, etc. The fact that Sea of Solitude may be far more literal about that, far more blatant about that, is an interesting prospect, but it also makes the game fairly predictable in this case. The moment you see a monster that looks and sounds like the protagonist, calling the protagonist a piece of shit, you think, oh, okay, well now I know exactly where this game is going, and the game pretty much goes in that direction without a detour. And to comprehensively emphasise that while this game did not hit me in the gut like I was maybe hoping it to do, there's a great sentence. You know what? Craig, leave that in. I've had to re-record this bit so many times, leave that in. Where was I? Right, yeah, so while it didn't quite tug on my heartstrings the way it seems to have done with some people, even though the themes inside this game are all very personally affecting to me, so it should have had more of an impact. But while I do lament that it didn't quite tug on me the way I hoped, it's not a game I regret having played. You know, I bought it, I played it through, I don't feel like I wasted my money or my time. It's just not a game I think I'll ever pick up again, or even much think about again. It's a nice enough time. That's really my takeaway from it. It's a nice enough game. But then again, I might just not know art, so I might not be seeing in this what some of the critics have seen in this. I mean, for an example, I was talking last night about how brilliant a movie Jason Lives is. Friday the 13th, Jason Lives is a brilliant movie. It starts with the protagonist, mind, digging up the body of a very literally dead for real murderer. Jason Voorhees starts that film very actually dead, but the protagonist digs the body up because he's still pissed at Jason to burn the body, but not before he gets so angry at the corpse, he gets a big metal pole off a fence and starts stabbing the body in the chest for no good reason, at which point lightning strikes, hits the metal pole, makes Jason's eyeball grow back because of reasons. He gets up, starts doing killing again. The protagonist pours gasoline on Jason, tries to burn him anyway, then the rain falls and puts the match out. The film starts with the weather on Jason's side. Then the camera zooms in on Jason's eyeball. Jason is in the eyeball, walking on screen from the side like James Bond, turns to the camera, slashes at the camera, then blood squirts at the audience. The rest of the film is just Jason going apeshit on people, but that is the dumbest sequence of events in any film ever, and that's what makes Jason Live so good. And everything I just said there is also the reason why you probably should never listen to me as a critic on anything artistic. So I've pretty much just wasted all your time today. I'm sorry.